Hi, I'm Ken. Here I am in Denver, Colorado on vacation. I happened to stop by here at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. Let's have a look inside and see what's here. But before we get into that, I want to interject. This channel's not about me or my travels. It's about my stamp collection. It's right there in the name, Ken's Stamp Collection. So this wouldn't be a good episode if it didn't include some of my stamps. In my last video, I showed you some treasures I got at a recent stamp show, and I've been spending some time going through those lots, and I've found a few more treasures. Well, they're treasures to me since they fill spaces in my collection, and I really like them. Anyway, I came across some odd stamps, these right here. I learned a lot when I was trying to figure out what these stamps were, and I'm going to share some of those learnings with you throughout this video. I'll tell you more about these as I go along. But I'm going to keep you hanging on that while we look a little bit more at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. A little disclaimer though, I didn't have time to plan out or film this video as well as I would have liked. Instead, I spent most of my limited time there talking to the people I met. The thing that impressed me most about the place was how many people there were. I think I saw more than 15 people on my visit at a philatelic library. To be fair, they were getting ready for their big annual auction. They run on donations just like the Spellman Museum, my local stamp museum and library. And since they don't maintain a large stamp collection there, most of the stamps that they get donated are auctioned off to fund the rest of the operation. Some of the people there were preparing for the auction for sure, but I had a sense that there would still be a lot of people there doing something else if they weren't busy with that auction. Others were processing donations and running the library itself. It all felt very familiar, like my time at the Spellman, except for one thing. Two of the people there were researchers, using the library for their own philatelic research. The Spellman has a philatelic library. It is impressive for sure, and even though it's about half the size of the Denver library, it still is a significantly valuable resource for researchers, and yet we very seldom get researchers using that library. The Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library had two when I visited, and that didn't seem at all unusual to them. At the Spellman, we would love to have a constant stream of visitors like that. I'll put in a plug now. The Spellman has a great library, and if you're doing philatelic research, you should come by and visit. I've used it a lot for my own research, and it's been very helpful, and I'd like to add we have a huge stamp collection in our vaults that's also available for research. So when you've looked through the library and want to see the real stamps in person to validate your findings, we have that for you too. We have such a great resource that I think it doesn't get used much because we don't publicize it well enough. Consider this an invitation to come in and use it. Now more of the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. So I just love what I see in this library. There's so many philatelic books. You can see stacks and stacks of periodicals. The place is full of volunteers, full of material, a great resource for the stamp collecting community. Just rows and rows and rows of stamp albums, books, etc. A really nice resource. I'm sorry about the quality of that video and the sound. I hadn't planned on making a video when I left on my trip, so I didn't bring any of my better equipment. Nor had I really coordinated any interviews, although that would have been nice too. Anyway, the video gives a good feel of the extent of their main library, their main philatelic library. I hope that was interesting. Now let's dive into those New Zealand stamps I showed you at the beginning. These stamps are all from that lot I bought at the last stamp show. They look a little unusual, right? These were issued as fiscal stamps. I'm going to say fiscal for now. That'll make more sense in a minute, but these kinds of stamps are usually called revenue stamps. Fiscal stamps often have this tall format or some other odd format. Here are some other fiscal stamps I have. Those first two are in terrible shape. They are U.S. Internal Revenue stamps. Those ones in particular are for matches. These would have been attached to a matchbox to show that the tax had been paid. These are a little unusual in that they were made for a specific match company. Usually revenue stamps are more generic for a product class, like this third stamp. This is a playing card stamp, which would have been attached to the box of a deck of cards. I remember these as a kid. The stamp was across the seal of the box, and for the ones I saw, sliced in two when the box was originally opened. The next one is a U.S. documentary stamp. It would have been attached to a legal document, and the value depended on the type of the document, or in some cases on the amount of the transaction. The next two served that same purpose in Great Britain. Notice that they're cancelled with a signature. Many revenue stamps are cancelled with a signature like this, serving a kind of notary value on the document. Moving down, that long blue stamp is a U.S. tobacco tax stamp. These were big, like this, to better seal a box or a tin of tobacco. Below that, on the bottom row, is a $2 wine tax stamp from 1914. This is a large stamp, bigger than for a bottle both in size and price. I suspect this one was on a case of wine, but some went straight onto barrels or even kegs. The stamp next to it was for cigarettes in the US. Can you see the pattern? Matches, tobaccos, cigarettes, wine, playing cards. The US has a lot of what sometimes get called sin taxes. The rest of the stamps along the bottom are from outside the US, first Canada and Newfoundland, then a stamp labeled Ontario Law Stamp. These were used on court documents to indicate things like a fine being paid. I like the U-shaped holes that have been punched into it. Punching a hole in the stamp was a common way to cancel revenue stamps, but this is the only one I've seen with U-shaped holes. This is probably to make it harder to counterfeit that cancel. Notice that many of these have that tall format to them, like my New Zealand stamps. A fiscal stamp is a stamp that's used to pay a tax. I'm sure some of you would argue that a postage stamp is a sort of fiscal or revenue stamp, and you might be right. I think I'd argue back that a postage stamps are a fee for a service, that service being sending a letter. Most fiscal stamps cover a tax on another product or service. Now let's take a look at some of the other spaces at the RMPS. So the library back here has a lot of periodicals in this roller shelf area. You can see a ton of periodicals. This is space that we just don't have space for at the Spellman, but really nice to see these things. These are kind of fun to roll out, and you won't see much there, but you roll them out and get a lot of stamps in this space. Right next to this is their archival older albums and periodicals. And then back here, they've got space for the Scandinavian Collectors Club that they share library space with, and 2 rooms of that for the Scandinavian library. I was just awestruck by how much archival material they had, and I was equally glad to see that people were using it. Anyway, let's get back to those New Zealand stamps. You probably all know by now that I collect regular issue postage stamps. For the most part, I don't bother with what a lot of collectors call back of the book stamps. Back of the book because the catalog lists them in the back of the catalog. These New Zealand stamps are back of the book stamps. Scott lists them in the AR section of the catalog. Stamps listed in the AR section of the catalog are called postal fiscal stamps. And that's why I keep talking about revenue stamps as fiscal stamps. But indeed, what is a postal fiscal stamp? You might have guessed that these stamps could be either used as postage stamps or as a fiscal stamps, and that's pretty close to right. As it turns out, there's a lot of stamps that could be used for either postage or as revenue stamps. Those stamps are listed with all the other stamps in the front of the catalog. I'll talk about those in a minute. But these stamps are listed in the back of the book, which means there's something different about them. That difference comes from the intended use of the stamps. When these stamps were first released, they were intended to be used only as a revenue stamp. Then at some point later, they were authorized for use as postage stamps too. Honestly, I think that's a ridiculous distinction. Just because they were not originally intended as postage stamps, they got relegated to the back of the book. These stamps are just as valid as postage stamps as any other stamp that was released with the intention of being a postage stamp right from the start. And because these are back-of-the-book stamps, and postal fiscal stamps tend to be kind of rare, they get forgotten about in many collections and left out of the main section of most commercial stamp albums. That's just not right. I think these deserve to be collected just like any other postage stamp. Now, some of these postal fiscal stamps were used as a revenue stamp, and others were used as postage stamps. Can you tell which ones are which? Since I don't collect revenue stamps, I need a way to tell them apart. Thankfully, that's usually not too hard. First, it should be obvious that an unused stamp hasn't been used either as a postage stamp or a revenue stamp yet. I haven't decided what to do with those yet, but I'm currently planning to keep those unused stamps as if they were a postage stamp, just like I'd keep any copy of an unused postage stamp. But for used stamps, like all of these, you can usually tell by the cancel what kind of stamp it is. Revenue stamps are typically canceled in harder to counterfeit ways. Sometimes they're signed, sometimes they have larger or oval cancellations, and sometimes they use less common colored inks for the cancel. Revenue stamps are usually associated with higher value transactions, and so the value of faking the official cancel is more than the value of the stamp. With postage, if you add a fake cancel to a letter, you essentially prevent yourself from mailing that letter. But if you add a fake cancel to a revenue document, you validate that you've paid the tax, so there is some motivation to fake these cancels. So look at these cancels. The first one is signed, it's a revenue cancel. The next one is oval and purple, another revenue cancel. You can also see the word bank in that cancel, which is another clue. The next two have very lightly colored cancels. While it's hard to be sure for these, most people would assume they are revenue cancels, especially since stamps with revenue cancels are almost universally worth less money. A savvy collector wouldn't be willing to accept these as the more expensive postally canceled version. The next one is easiest to tell. It has blue ink, is a large oval, and it clearly has the words paid and bank in the cancel. And finally, the last stamp on the top line is our first postal cancel. It's round and uses black ink. It's a little fuzzy, but it's clear enough to convince me. I'll be saving this one in my collection for sure. It's a used postage stamp. Actually, I'll be saving all of these as space fillers on my page, but with a note to replace them when I get either a better postally used or even an unused copy. The next row of stamps should be mostly straightforward now. The one in the middle is postally used, and all the others are fiscally used. That last one might be a little less obvious. It fooled me for a moment. It uses black ink and has a round cancel, but it's also larger than a typical postal cancel, and if you look carefully, you can read the word bank on it. Take a look at these revenue stamps again. There are two other ways here that show a revenue stamp. The first is like those match or playing card stamps. They get stuck across an opening when they're used, sealing the product. Used stamps like this are often ripped when the product is opened. The other common method is a hole punch of some kind. Remember those U-punched holes on the bottom stamp? Revenue stamps often have a large hole punched into them. I can't ever remember seeing a postage stamp canceled with a hole punch. New Zealand isn't the only country to have postal fiscal stamps. The Wikipedia page for postal fiscal stamps lists a number of other countries. The first one is the UK. Those last two stamps in the top row are postal fiscal stamps from the UK. You've already figured out that those two are fiscally used. Too bad for me. There's also postal fiscal stamps from Bechuanaland, Dominica, Hong Kong, Tobago, Venezuela, and Western Australia. I know there are others that the Wikipedia article doesn't mention. It's not a lot of countries, but more than just the one. Now you may think you can just go to the AR section for each of these countries and find the relevant stamps. Unfortunately, it isn't that easy. While the Scott Catalog lists the postal fiscal stamps for Bechuanaland and New Zealand in the AR section, it doesn't list them at all for Great Britain, Tobago, or Venezuela. Stanley Gibbons lists the UK ones in the back of their catalog. To make it even less consistent, the one postal fiscal stamp I can find for Hong Kong is listed with a front of the book Scott catalog number. My head is just spinning. Let's let all that sink in while we take another look at the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. The library has a second building that I thought was going to be mostly storage, but when I went over, I was so pleasantly surprised. So I happened to the other building they have. This is a building where they hold meetings, and over in this building I've got a small museum of postal artifacts. Really nice place to come visit while you're here in Denver. Besides that wall of artifacts, there was a meeting room used by various local stamp clubs. And in a space towards the back, there was another room for youth programs. It's so good to encourage kids to get into the hobby. Now we're going to dive into a few more stamps. The following stamps are stamps that have a feel like postal fiscal stamps, but they really are technically not postal fiscal stamps. Let's take a look at those. I know, these are just regular old British stamps, and you might be wondering why I'm showing these. Well, British stamps were often labeled for postage and revenue. Starting in 1881 with this stamp, the penny lilac, some British stamps were authorized for both postal and revenue purposes. See along the top of this stamp it says postage and inland revenue. On later stamps that gets shortened to postage and revenue or just postage revenue. Notice that the stamp on the left is postally used with a cancel and the one on the right is fiscally used with a pen cancel. You should be able to see that in these stamps now. All the stamps on the bottom row say postage and revenue. I used to think that was just a fancy way of saying revenue from postage, although I'm not really sure I had a strong understanding of what I meant by saying that. Anyway, these stamps are valid for both postal and fiscal usages. Along the top row are stamps that just say postage, or stamps that don't say either postage or revenue. That first stamp is a penny red. It was issued before the law that let stamps be used for revenue came about. It's just a postage stamp. The last stamp is the familiar Machen stamp. It doesn't say postage or revenue either. This one is valid as postage but not as revenue, because after they switched to decimal values, stamps were no longer valid for revenue. The stamps in the middle either say postage or nothing at all. My research was unclear about whether these could be used for revenue. They aren't labeled for it, but it's possible that it was a legal use. I'm just not sure. I'm showing you these to make a distinction between these stamps and our New Zealand Postal Fiscal stamps. I can't say it's a very important distinction, but at least it helps explain why these stamps are in the main part of the catalog and Postal Fiscal stamps are in a separate section. Catalog makers typically put stamps like these, which were originally intended as postage stamps, in the main section of the catalog. But for our Postal Fiscal stamps, these stamps were intended initially as revenue stamps. They weren't valid as postage when they were first released. At some later point, these were made valid as postage. That might be because there was a shortage of these values in postal stocks or because there was extra stock of the revenue stamps that could be used up for postage. At any rate, when a revenue stamp is made valid for postage, catalog makers often put them in a separate section and call them Postal Fiscal stamps. Like I said, it's not much of a distinction. And here's my Stanley Gibbons catalog. Way in the back here is a section right there on Postal Fiscal stamps. So Stanley Gibbons has a section for these stamps. Let's take a look at these stamps. They are British Postal Fiscal stamps. I have just these two of them, and you can see by the signature cancellations that these have been used fiscally too. So these are technically not postage stamps, but revenue stamps. Postage stamps like these go for a bit of money, but stamps like this used for revenue purposes sell for much less. Unfortunately, the catalog doesn't even list prices for them as fiscally used stamps. This, on the other hand, let me get this out. This, on the other hand, is my Scott catalog, and it's the Scott catalog that has Great Britain in it, the G section. In the back of this, or in the British section, it doesn't list those Postal Fiscal stamps in the Scott catalog, although it does list Postal Fiscal stamps for Bechuanaland, and it does list these New Zealand Postal Fiscal stamps that I showed you before. So go figure. I don't know why Scott chooses to show Postal Fiscal stamps for one country but not for others. I've been joking recently that mint copies of these British stamps aren't actually postage stamps. See, these stamps could either be a postage stamp or a revenue stamp, and you just can't tell what it is until it's used. I amuse myself at least. There's one other thing to show you about British stamps. An overprint has been added to this one saying Merseyside and North Wales Electricity Board. That shows that this stamp is intended to label a receipt for an electric bill. No, the electric bill wasn't 2p. Actually, I don't know what the denomination means in this case. This stamp is also for 2p, but the bill is for £7 and some change. If anyone knows more about why this stamp is for 2p, drop a note in the comments. Also note that the bill collector signed the receipt across the stamp to cancel it. Anyway, the point is that while some British stamps were valid for both postal and fiscal purposes, the Postal Fiscal stamp was first and foremost a fiscal stamp that was later pressed into use as a postage stamp. These stamps are from Spain. Notice the words along the top of the stamp. They say Correos y Telegrafos, postage and telegraphs. These stamps are like the British postage and revenue stamps, but these cover either postage or the fee to send a telegraph. The telegraph version of the stamps are cancelled with a hole through them like the one on the right. These are much less valuable than the postally used stamps like the one on the left. This stamp is a Nicaraguan postage stamp. It's been overprinted with the word telegraphos, obliterating the word choreos for postage. This stamp has been repurposed as a revenue stamp, and it's not a postage stamp at all. In some cases, stamps like this one existed. This stamp was originally printed as a revenue stamp. It was later overprinted, striking out the word revenue and adding the word postage, and then changing the rate. Note that this stamp is no longer valid as a revenue stamp. It's been changed to just be a postage stamp. This stamp is not a postal fiscal stamp either. Scott lists it in the regular section of the catalog, just as it should. Now let's take a look at that last segment of my visit to the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. Gary, who is also a curator of the artifacts we saw earlier, offered to show me the library's back rooms. So Gary walked me back to their storage room. Gary, can you say hi and tell people what you do here?
Hello, yes, I'm a volunteer here. I do scanning for the auctions and curate the little museum we have.
Well, I showed you that museum a few moments ago. Gary took me back into the back where they have a collection of auction catalogs by company. This is a storage room that's just really impressive about how many volumes. Well, you can see how much is written about philately and stamp collecting, etc. Really a tremendous room full of storage. So we've got the library that I went into. We have the front area where Gary curates the museum and they have meetings, and then they have this whole big area of the details if you need to get into this level of detail. Just a great resource here.
Many of the volumes in that back room were auction catalogs. There's a wealth of information about rare items in auction catalogs for a patient researcher. I really had such a nice visit to the library. Everyone was very welcoming and friendly, and I'm sure you'll find the same if you go visit them, and I encourage you to do that if you're in the Denver area. I hope you also enjoyed learning about these postal fiscal stamps I found. You should know now why these have a place in my collection, and you should be able to identify these in your own collection in case you get a few of your own. Now I better stop and add these to my own collection. Happy collecting.